into this video, and then I'll stop when I think we need it.
And I'm a human. But let's pretend for a moment that I'm a moth. And not just any moth. A peppered moth. Now let's pretend that I'm living in London in the early 1800s, right as the Industrial Revolution is starting. Life is swell. My light-colored body lets me blend in with the light-colored lichens and tree bark, which means that birds have a hard time seeing me, and which means that I get to live. But it's starting to get noticeably darker around here with all these coal-powered factories spewing soot into the air, and suddenly all the trees have gone from looking like this to looking like this. So thanks to the soot-covered everything, I've got problems. But you know who doesn't have problems? My brother. He looks like this. Yeah, he has a different form of the gene that affects pigmentation. Moths like him represent about 2% of all the peppered moths at the start of the Industrial Revolution, but by 1895, it'll be 95%. Why? Well, you're probably already guessing. As the environment gets dirtier, darker moths will be eaten less often, and therefore will have more opportunities to make baby moths, while the white ones will get eaten more, so over time the black-colored trait will become more common.
So, natural selection, and I just have a little note screen over here. Natural selection has to do primarily with the chance of survival being increased. So, these moths in this very, very well-known example, they made it easier to blend into their surroundings. So adaptation changes when the animal with the best quality for survival increases in numbers. So those peppered moths, they can be seen. So over and over and over again, they are more common to be there for predators. They are less likely to have that environmental adaptation of survival. So here we go.
As for me, my friends, it is a wonderful example of natural selection, the process by which certain inherited traits make it easier for some individuals to thrive and multiply, changing the genetic makeup of populations over time. For this revelation, which remains one of the most important revelations in biology, we have to thank Charles Darwin, who first identified this process in his revolutionary 1859 book on the origin of species by natural selection. Now, lots of factors play a role in how species change over time, including mutation, migration, random changes in how frequently some alleles show up, a process known as genetic drift. But natural selection is the most powerful and most important cause of evolutionary change, which is why today we're going to talk about the principles behind it and the different ways in which it works. Darwin came to understand the process of natural selection because he spent his adult life, even most of his childhood, obsessed with observing nature. He studied barnacles, earthworms, birds, rocks, tortoises, fossils, fish, insects, and to some extent even his own family, and I'll get back to that in a bit. But it was during Darwin's famous voyage on the HMS Beagle in the 1830s, a surveying expedition around the world, that he began to formulate this theory. Darwin was able to study all kinds of organisms, and he kept amazing journals. Looking back on his notes, he hit upon a couple of particularly important factors in species survival. One of them was the many examples of adaptations he noticed on his journey. The ways in which organisms seem to be ideally shaped to enhance their survival and reproduction in specific environments. Maybe the most famous example of these were the variations of beaks Darwin observed among the finches in the remote Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. He observed more than a dozen closely related finch species, all of which were quite similar to mainland finch species, but each island species had different shaped and sized beaks that were adapted to the food available specifically on each island. If there were hard seeds, the beaks were thick. If there were insects, the beaks were skinny and pointed. If there were cactus fruit, the beaks were sharp to puncture the fruit skin. These superior inherited traits led Darwin to another idea: the finches increased fitness for their environment. That is, their relative ability to survive and create offspring. Explaining the effects of adaptation and relative fitness would become central to Darwin's idea of natural selection. And today, we often define natural selection and describe how it drives evolutionary change by 4 basic principles based on Darwin's observations. The first principle is that different members of a population have all kinds of individual variations. These characteristics, whether they're body size, hair color, blood type, facial markings, metabolisms, reflexes, they're called phenotypes. The second is that many of these variations are heritable and can be passed on to offspring. If a trait happens to be favorable, it does future generations no good if it can't be passed on. Third, and this one tends to get glossed over a lot, even though it's probably the most interesting, is Darwin's observation that populations can often have way more offspring than resources like food and water can support. This leads to what Darwin...
So that's interesting. We do these things. So essentially, Darwin is saying that traits that are desirable are going to be more common over time through reproduction. But animals by nature will reproduce at rates that deplete the supplies they have, causing other adaptations. This is true in humans. One of the world's biggest problems at this particular moment is overpopulation. People are reproducing at greater rates, and we don't have the means to support life for that many more years as far as oil and gas reserves, oil itself, just being able to use plastic. That's why being conscientious of those carbon footprints, that's kind of why we did that activity, is that we are very, very guilty of this part as humans. The struggle for existence that he's about to talk about. Eventually, if you take for granted the things that you have for survival, they won't be there anymore. So the pandemic is a good illustration of this. People going to the stores and hoarding items, because eventually, if they're not there, you want to live in luxury. You want to have the things that are desirable to live a comfy life. And what's happening during this thing? We are still seeing a huge amount of reproduction, and we're in a time where we don't have the goods to suppress all the life. So it's just an interesting biological look at kind of what's going on. So let's get back.
Called The Struggle for Existence. He was inspired here by the work of Thomas Malthus, an economist who wrote that when human populations get too big, we get things like plague and famine and wars, and then only some of us survive and continue to reproduce. If you missed the SciShow Infusion that we did on human overpopulation today and Malthus's predictions, you should check it out now. This finally leads to the last principle of natural selection, which is that given all of this competition for resources, heritable traits that affect individuals' fitness can lead to variations in their survival and reproductive rates. It's just another way of saying that those with favorable traits are more likely to come out on top and will be more successful with their baby making. So in order to wrap all these principles together, in order for natural selection to take place, a population has to have variations, some of which are heritable, and when a variation makes an organism more competitive, that variation will tend to be selected. Like with the peppered moth. It survived because there was a variation within the species, the dark coloration, which was heritable, and in turn allowed every moth that inherited that trait to better survive the hungry birds of London. But notice how this works. A single variation in a single organism is only the very beginning of the process. The key is that individuals don't evolve. Instead, natural selection produces evolutionary change because it changes the genetic composition of entire populations. And that occurs through interactions between individuals and their environment. Let's get back to Darwin.
Okay, I think this is good for what we're going to do for this week. I'm going to go ahead and save these notes, And then next week, we're really going to take a look at competition and what does it look like for these adaptations to have over time, and what does that mean for the rest of the population. We kind of touched base with this on like energy pyramids and talking about predators and things of that nature, but we're just going to move forward and kind of finish out the year talking about this natural selection processes. What did that look like? Why did some species cause extinction, and what are some desirable traits that humans find necessary in reproductive partners? So, I mean, are we looking for strength, health, looks? And so we're going to examine what would be desirable traits if you were going to make the perfect human. So next week we're going to get into a little bit more theory and a little bit more brain stuff. This week we are just applying that knowledge that we have learned. So good luck. Again, get a hold of me if you need me, and talk to you soon.